Hey there, lovely people! Welcome back to another Writing Tip Tuesday. I'm Sammi, and I like to learn about writing through reading and share what I learn with you. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. It'll really help me out and tell YouTube that more people may like this video too. This week, I want to talk to you about linear timelines. This last Saturday, I posted a video on the invisible life of Addie LaRue, and you can watch that video up here if you haven't seen it yet. I talked about how a lot of its strength comes from the nonlinear timeline and the way that it has the ability to bounce back and forth from the present to the past. I want to talk to you about nonlinear timelines because I think that book is a great example of why people should write them, and there are some other great examples as to why people should write in a linear timeline rather than nonlinear. Why write a linear story? Most of the time it makes the most sense. You go from the beginning through the middle to the end, maybe with a couple of flashbacks here and there, but it's just point A to point B in the most part. A linear timeline is usually written when it doesn't make sense to do a nonlinear timeline. It's important to write the way that it makes sense. There's a trend going on where people will write a story in a way that is popular. So if The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue is a very popular book right now, other writers may try to monopolize on that feeling by taking their story and putting it in that kind of jumbled order. But if it doesn't make sense for the story, the way that the time difference in Addie LaRue makes sense because of the world and the conflict and the plot, it makes complete sense. But if you're telling like a standard rom-com, it may not make sense to bounce back and forth like that. Anyone can write their story out of order just because it's popular, but if there's no reason behind it, it's wrong. Just write it in the regular linear order. Why do people write in non-linear fashions? What's a good reason to write out of order like that? The back and forth of a non-linear story can create the opportunity for a really unique juxtaposition that is very at the forefront, the way that it is in Addie LaRue. While you can force this juxtaposition through a non-linear timeline, if it's not something that is a strong point into the purpose of your story, it doesn't necessarily make the most sense to force it, you know? So if your juxtaposition between the past and the present and how time, it repeats itself, like in Addie LaRue, or good and evil juxtaposed directly against each other between this chapter and this chapter, if that's what you want to draw attention to, it makes perfect sense. But if you're just doing it because you can, don't. Another benefit of the nonlinear timeline is it can build suspense. You can have multiple different cliffhangers happening simultaneously. It's the same way that a movie will do a meanwhile back at the ranch cut, where you have two separate sets of characters who are going through extreme situations. They'll have they're flying a plane through a meteor storm, and this one, they are sneaking into the enemy's camp. They'll have this one flying through, something will come straight at the camera in a way that you think that the character is gonna get hit, and then they'll cut. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, and we'll see what this character is doing and how they're getting really close to their target and they're being really sneaky, and then their shoe makes a squeaky noise, and then we cut back to the high intensity story where the meteor is coming towards them, and then they'll dodge out of it, and you've got this building tension because both sets of characters are leaving you on this cliffhanger and you care about both sets. So if you have some conflict that is done in the past and you don't know what happened, and you just know what you know from the last chapter in this timeline, and then you go into the present, let's say. In the present, you know what's going on in the conflict of that. If you leave on a high tension moment at the end of that chapter and resolve the conflict from the past, you can keep building that cliffhanger in the suspense and develop that kind of tension in a way that you couldn't do it if it was a beginning to end story. So you get that opportunity to build a little bit more tension, but you shouldn't be doing every single chapter ends in a very dramatic cliffhanger because that can be traumatizing. I shouldn't say traumatizing, but it can be very difficult for your readers, especially if they're trying to say, I'm just gonna read one more chapter and then go to bed. Sometimes we need to go to bed. A nonlinear timeline also has the ability to build dramatic irony, where you can tell us something that happens in the future at the beginning of a situation, and then readers know something, the characters don't, so you're just waiting for them to find out what you know. I think a really great example of this is the prologue to Kindred by this name, which I cannot remember right now off the top of my head. It's been a couple of years since I read it, but that book starts at the very end of the story. We get this crazy high intensity situation where she's got blood everywhere and there's like pain and limbs missing, and there's a lot that's going on, and the readers have no idea what's going on. The characters, obviously, they would know, but then the start of chapter 1 is at the very beginning of the story, and then it goes chronologically from there, and we're just waiting the whole time to know what happened, how did we get there. If you skip the prologue on any book, you are missing out for sure, because they always give you something, but that's besides the point. That builds this dramatic irony where we know something really bad is going to happen from the situation that our main character is in, but she doesn't. And we don't know how it happens, and we desperately want to know how it happens. Another example would be like mystery novels that give you the answer at the very beginning, and like you know who did the crime, and then you just wait to figure out how the detectives are going to figure it out. But I think Kindred is a really great example of something that's not like, here's the answer, and then builds that dramatic irony. A nonlinear timeline can also build insight into your characters. If your main character has this cold exterior and we don't know why in the present day, if we give them time in the past when they were like happy-go-lucky and like had all this joy and hope and trust, and then watch that fall into something that causes trauma, that makes them change who they are like that, we have that opportunity to learn about the character's motives and the character's reasons for acting the way that they are by having that nonlinear timeline. But that can also be done simply with one flashback. So it's not necessary to do a completely nonlinear timeline unless the entire story of what happened in the past is just as important as what is happening in the present. Another great reason to use a nonlinear timeline is if it ties into the theme. The theme in Addie LaRue relates back to the timeline because it's talking about how you can impact people and make a difference in the world even when you don't know that you're doing it, and how people can make an influence on you even if you don't know that. So Addie LaRue's experience through the history of time, basically her entire life goes over this long span of time and gives you these entire relationships that have an impact but don't like have any memory of it. That's one of the themes of the story. And you can do this with other things too. Your structure will influence the meaning behind the story. So if you have a story that start to finish is a couple meets, they fall in love, they fall out of love, and then they break up, and that's how you tell the story, the theme is kind of gonna read as love is pain. You're not gonna be happy and that kind of stuff. But if you want your theme to be more optimistic or like love is worth the pain, you can start off with the relationship falling apart and then bring the falling in love and the happiness and all of that and tie that in at the end. And you'll have a totally different meaning behind that story, but you'll have the same story if you put it into chronological order. But the meaning that you get out of it is different because you chose to structure it differently and influence the theme that way. I will say pretty strongly that nonlinear timelines are not for those who do not plan, because there are a lot of details to keep track of and how to know what to bounce back to and what to repeat and tell and different times, and how to know when to change timelines and how to keep track of what the plot is and what the theme and what all. There's a lot of stuff to keep track of, so if you're not someone who's going to plan out the entire story of the past and the entire story of the future and see where they line up and juxtapose and bounce those in together, card them together, it's going to be a lot harder for you to just sit down and think, oh, well, I'm going to talk about the past and the future simultaneously and blah, 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 and just go by the seat of your pants. I don't think that will work. I don't think it will be as impactful as it could have been if it was planned. So I'm going to strongly advise that if you want to do a nonlinear timeline, to plan it or write the story in chronological order first and then on an edit, card them together. I think that would be better in general, but it's definitely going to take a lot more work than just writing from start to finish and taking the time to do that effort. If it's worth it, if it'll make your story better to make it in a nonlinear pattern, you should do that work. But if it's not going to make it better, and if you're doing it just because The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue was really popular, I wouldn't put forth the effort. I think that doing a nonlinear timeline would be a really fun exercise to try out with a story maybe you've already written from point A to point B. If you have a story that might work better as a nonlinear timeline, play around with it. take the pieces and shuffle the cards and see what happens, but it might not work. Sometimes it's better off in a linear timeline. Some stories are better that way, and it's important to know the value of the story that you're telling over the gimmick of choosing a popular way of writing and writing that way again. That's my advice. And if you don't take it, that's fine. You live your life, you write what you gotta write. I'm just happy you're writing. If you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you would leave a like. If you don't want to miss another upload from me, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, and it'll let you know every time I post. I will be back on Saturday with another Story Study Saturday, and I will be back again on Tuesday after that with another Writing Tip Tuesday. Meet me down in the comments if you want to have a little book chat. Let's talk about what books you want me to read and what you think about nonlinear timelines. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you on Saturday.